Just before dawn in Texas, when the highways were so empty that every sound carried, multiple federal convoys suddenly stopped at the same moment outside a logistics center that most people would pass without a second glance. There were no sirens, no flashing red and blue lights, and no warning signals of what was about to unfold, only a heavy silence as DEA agents, FBI teams, SWAT units, and supporting forces stepped out together, moving from the shadows with the kind of precision that comes from long preparation. The instant the warehouse doors were breached, the illusion of normality collapsed because the sealed containers, the interior layout, and the lingering chemical traces quietly revealed that this was not an ordinary storage site, but a drug coordination hub hidden deep inside the United States. Within the first few minutes, agents realized they were facing something far beyond any local case they had handled before, as the scale, the organization, and the calm order of the facility suggested it had been operating undetected for a very long time. But the moment that made the air feel heavier was not the volume of drugs laid out before them. It was the list of names that appeared next. A list that made it clear this raid had just touched a secret far deeper, darker, and more dangerous than anyone had been prepared to confront. If you want to keep following how hidden networks like this are uncovered, how federal forces move in silence, and how operations that begin in empty warehouses can reshape America's fight against organized crime, subscribe to Military Power, because what happens after this moment reaches far beyond a single raid. Long before federal vehicles moved into position that morning, warning signs had already been spreading quietly across the southern United States. Hospitals were reporting sharp increases in overdoses linked to synthetic drugs, while medical examiners noted death patterns that no longer followed familiar trends. The numbers rose fast but not evenly, clustering around specific regions instead of staying close to the border. Inside federal databases, analysts began to see the same anomaly. Large quantities of fentanyl and methamphetamine were being seized far from traditional entry points, appearing deep inside the country with no clear trail back to the border. Interceptions at crossings continued, yet they no longer explained what was reaching American streets. Something had changed in how these drugs were moving. As investigators compared shipping data, a new picture started to form. Freight routes were behaving strangely, with trucks diverted mid-journey, cargo manifests altered between stops, and deliveries delayed without explanation. Warehouses that looked inactive after dark still showed power usage, security movement, and internal activity. These were not abandoned buildings. They were operating quietly, on purpose. Texas soon stood out. Its highways connect ports, rail lines, and distribution centers that feed much of the country. What makes Texas a commercial engine also makes it vulnerable, because a single logistics hub can redirect goods to dozens of states within hours. From a cartel's perspective, controlling such a hub offers reach without the risks of border exposure. Another detail troubled investigators. Smaller drug labs were becoming harder to find. Instead of unfinished product, agents were encountering drugs already packaged, labeled, and prepared for transport. Pills were pressed to resemble prescription medicine. Meth was wrapped like legitimate freight. This level of organization suggested central coordination, not scattered operations. That realization shifted the investigation. A lab can be replaced, a shipment can be lost, but a logistics hub functions as a command center, a place where routes are adjusted, losses absorbed, and supply kept moving. Taking one down does not just slow distribution, it reveals the entire system behind it. Federal agencies quietly intensified cooperation, merging seizure reports, financial tracking, and highway inspections. Patterns began to align. Shell companies appeared across multiple states. Rental trucks traced back to the same storage contracts. Even drone activity showed up near key transfer points, briefly filling gaps in surveillance before disappearing. This was not about drugs slipping through cracks. It was a system designed to hide inside America's own infrastructure. Logistics hubs provided cover because they were expected to be busy. Inspecting everything would paralyze legitimate trade, and the people behind this network understood that balance perfectly. For months, authorities waited, watching for signs of panic or shutdown. None came. The flow continued smoothly, as if untouched. That calm was the final confirmation. This was not a nervous operation. It was one that believed itself untouchable. And when the warehouse doors were finally breached, every suspicion was confirmed at once. And as the evidence stacked higher with each quiet discovery, one question became impossible to ignore. How many other operations like this are still moving unnoticed through the same highways and warehouses Americans pass every day? The moment the outer doors gave way, the operation shifted from planning to survival. SWAT teams moved first, followed closely by DEA agents wearing full protective gear, because this was not a space where mistakes were forgiven. Inside the warehouse, the air itself was a threat. Fine white residue-coated metal surfaces, plastic wrapping, and the concrete floor, and every step carried the risk of disturbing fentanyl powder invisible to the naked eye. Unlike a typical drug bust, no one rushed forward. Movements were slow, deliberate, and controlled. Breathing masks stayed sealed. Gloves were checked again and again. In operations like this, speed does not mean safety. Precision does. A single careless touch, a cloud of dust kicked up by a boot, could turn a routine search into a medical emergency within seconds. As teams advanced deeper, the scale of the site began to reveal itself. This was not a storage room stacked with random boxes. The warehouse had been divided into zones, each with a clear function. On one side, long tables were lined with pill presses and molds. Trays filled with tablets were stacked floor to ceiling, each designed to look like legitimate prescription medication. Initial counts stunned even veteran agents. More than 1.2 million fake pills were already packaged and ready for shipment. Further inside, agents found sealed pallets wrapped in industrial plastic. When cut open, the contents left no doubt. Roughly 850 kilograms of methamphetamine, compressed, labeled, and prepared like commercial cargo. Nearby, in reinforced containers marked with false shipping codes, sat approximately 400 kilograms of fentanyl. Not diluted, not mixed. Pure enough that a few grains could kill. Weapons were stored close by, not for street-level enforcement, but for protection. Assault rifles, handguns, and ammunition were positioned near access points, suggesting the operators expected intrusion one day, even if they believed it would never come. Cash was discovered in hidden compartments, bundled and stacked, totaling millions of dollars. This was not profit waiting to be laundered, it was operating capital. What struck agents most was the efficiency of the layout. Drugs moved in one direction, packaging flowed in another. Finished products exited through loading bays positioned to allow rapid transfer into trucks without drawing attention. Surveillance equipment covered every angle inside the facility, while external cameras blended into normal warehouse security systems. Everything about the design pointed to speed, control, and discretion. At this point, the raid paused briefly, not because of resistance, but because of risk. Fentanyl changes the rules of enforcement. Unlike other narcotics, it does not require ingestion to be deadly. Accidental skin contact or airborne exposure can overwhelm the nervous system in minutes. That reality forces law enforcement to treat every surface, every package, and every breath as potentially lethal. This is why fentanyl has become one of the most dangerous threats facing modern policing. Officers are trained to confront armed suspects. They are not meant to fight chemistry. In spaces like this warehouse, danger does not announce itself. It waits. The risk is silent, fast, and unforgiving. Despite this, the teams continued. Evidence was photographed, logged, and secured. Each step added weight to the same conclusion. This operation was not improvised. It was engineered. Someone had invested serious money, serious planning, and serious protection into keeping this facility running unnoticed. By the time the first phase of the search was complete, agents understood something critical. This was not a local distribution point feeding one city or one region. The volume, the organization, and the logistics indicated a system capable of supplying large portions of the country without interruption. And that realization led to a far more unsettling question. Who had the power, resources, and reach to operate something this large, hidden in plain sight, right inside the United States? As evidence teams continued cataloging what they had found inside the warehouse, analysts working parallel streams began to focus on a different question. A facility like this did not operate on instinct or violence alone. It required coordination, discipline, and long-term planning. That meant someone was pulling the strings from a distance. The name that surfaced was Rafael El Sombra Ortega. Unlike traditional cartel figures, Ortega was not a public face. He did not release videos, issue threats, or appear in seized phone footage boasting about power. In fact, his absence from the spotlight was deliberate. Ortega's strength came from staying invisible while controlling a network estimated to be worth more than $5.2 billion. He did not move drugs himself. He did not manage street crews. His role was far more strategic. Ortega functioned as a coordinator, a figure who designed the system rather than participating in its daily operations. From production to transport to distribution, decisions flowed upward, not outward. The violence happened far below him. Financial records tied to shell companies offered the first clear view of how this empire worked. Logistics firms registered in multiple states handled freight contracts that appeared legitimate on paper. International accounts funneled payments through layers of transactions that blurred ownership and origin. Each company looked ordinary in isolation. Together, they formed a machine. This structure explained why the warehouse had operated undisturbed for so long. Ortega did not rely on intimidation to protect his assets. He relied on complexity. By spreading responsibility across contracts, vendors, and intermediaries, no single point of failure appeared obvious. Even when one part was exposed, the rest could continue. Investigators began to see a familiar pattern. Modern cartels no longer resemble street gangs fighting over corners. They look more like corporations, with divisions, redundancies, and contingency planning. Their power does not come from firepower alone, but from their ability to move money, data, and goods faster than law enforcement can react. This shift marks a fundamental change in how criminal organizations operate. Guns attract attention. Cash leaves trails. Data, when hidden correctly, moves quietly. Ortega understood this. His empire was designed to blend into the systems that keep the modern economy running. What made him especially dangerous was distance. Ortega insulated himself from risk by placing layers between his decisions and their consequences. If a shipment failed, another route opened. If a warehouse was compromised, others remained untouched. He treated losses as variables, not setbacks. By the time his name was confirmed, federal officials understood they were no longer dealing with a single operation. They were confronting a model, one that could be copied, scaled, and rebuilt if left intact. Removing Ortega would not just disrupt distribution. It would test whether the system itself could survive without its architect. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered something even more troubling. Because Ortega did not rely on money alone, he relied on technology. And as the network began to collapse under coordinated federal pressure, one final question loomed. When a system like this starts to fall apart, does its architect disappear into the noise, or does he make one last move to protect what remains? The most dangerous discoveries did not sit on pallets or behind steel doors. They were stored inside the laptops pulled from sealed offices at the edge of the warehouse, machines that looked ordinary, but carried the blueprint of how the entire operation stayed invisible for so long. As forensic teams began extracting data, a pattern emerged almost immediately. This network was not reacting to law enforcement. It was anticipating it. Shipment routes were not fixed. They shifted in real time, guided by software that monitored traffic, inspections, and delays across multiple states. When one highway slowed, trucks were rerouted. When a checkpoint appeared, cargo vanished from the planned path before authorities even arrived. This was not guesswork. It was coordination. One system tracked truck locations continuously, updating routes minute by minute. Drivers did not know the full journey. They received instructions in short segments, limiting what any single arrest could reveal. If a vehicle stopped moving unexpectedly, the system flagged it as compromised and cut it loose from the network. Another file revealed something even more unsettling. Small, unmanned aircraft were being used not for delivery, but for surveillance and deception. These drones monitored transfer points, scouted law enforcement movement, and when tracked, destroyed themselves mid-flight. No recovery, no hardware, no trail. The goal was not speed. It was denial. Routes changed constantly. A shipment that started in Texas could end up in the Midwest, the Southeast, or the Northeast within days, with no predictable pattern. This chaos was intentional. Traditional enforcement relies on mapping routes and predicting behavior. Ortega's system was designed to deny patterns altogether. Once this information was shared across federal agencies, the scale of the threat became impossible to ignore. This was no longer about drugs moving illegally. It was about a privately controlled logistics network operating across state lines, faster and more flexible than many legal supply chains. The response escalated immediately. Operations expanded beyond Texas as synchronized stops were planned across multiple states. Timing mattered. Hitting one truck meant nothing. Hitting many at once could fracture the system. Over a narrow window, law enforcement intercepted cartel vehicles on highways, at distribution centers, and near transfer zones. Drivers were detained. Cargo was seized. Routes went dark. For the first time, the network hesitated. Internal messages recovered later showed confusion. Automated reroutes failed when too many nodes collapsed at once. Backup routes overlapped. Redundancy turned into congestion. What had once been fluid became rigid under pressure. This moment revealed why federal officials began classifying the case as a national security concern. A network like this does not just move drugs. It exploits the same infrastructure that keeps the country running. When criminal systems learn to outpace oversight across multiple states, they challenge the foundations of control itself. Traditional enforcement is built around borders and jurisdictions. Ortega's operation ignored both. It treated the United States as a single internal market, stitched together by highways, data, and automation. That made it resilient. It also made it dangerous. As the network began to collapse, something else became clear. Ortega had planned for this scenario. Contingency files showed fallback options, emergency protocols, and asset liquidation steps designed to protect the core leadership even if distribution failed. The system was breaking, but the architect was still free. And as pressure closed in from every direction, Ortega made the only move he had left. As the multi-state network began to fracture, federal attention shifted toward a single, remaining objective. The system was collapsing, routes were failing, and assets were being seized. Yet the architect himself was still beyond reach. For investigators, the operation could not be considered complete. while Rafael El Sombra Ortega remained free. The final move came quietly. In the early hours of the morning, federal units converged on a fortified estate located far from the chaos of the warehouse raids. From the outside, it looked like a private residence designed for isolation, surrounded by controlled access points, layered security, and long sightlines meant to detect intrusion early. This was not a hideout, built for escape. It was built for confidence. That confidence proved misplaced. Federal teams sealed the perimeter with precision, cutting off every possible exit before the first door was breached. There were no warning shots and no dramatic confrontation. Ortega had no time to relocate, no chance to activate contingency plans, and no network left to shield him. When agents entered the residence, they found a man who had built distance between himself and danger, only to discover that distance had finally run out. The arrest was swift. Ortega was taken into custody without resistance, ending years of operating behind layers of intermediaries, contracts, and digital insulation. For the first time, the individual who had coordinated the system stood alone, separated from the machinery that once protected him. Almost immediately, the consequences expanded beyond the arrest itself. Data seized during the operation confirmed what analysts had long suspected, but could not yet prove. A list began to circulate internally, one that linked more than 20 politicians, officials, and influential figures to the broader network. Some names appeared through financial ties, others through regulatory blind spots, protection arrangements, or deliberate inaction. This was not uniform corruption, but selective alignment, enough to slow oversight and redirect attention when needed. This revelation reframed the entire case. Cartels do not survive for years at this scale, without more than money and fear. Political corruption provides stability. It creates safe lanes, delays enforcement, and turns routine oversight into empty procedure. When criminal networks intersect with power, the damage extends far beyond drugs on the street. Institutions weaken, trust erodes, accountability becomes negotiable. For federal authorities, this was the most sobering realization of the operation. The warehouse, the routes, and even Ortega himself were replaceable. The conditions that allowed such a network to exist were not. When crime embeds itself within political systems, enforcement becomes slower, harder, and more fragile. The arrest marked a clear victory. A major operation had been dismantled. A central figure was in custody. Billions of dollars in narcotics and assets were removed from circulation. Yet as officials reviewed the full scope of the case, one truth became impossible to ignore. The operation had succeeded, but the threat had not disappeared. When the operation finally came to a close, the numbers alone were enough to signal its scale. Tens of tons of synthetic drugs were removed from circulation. A national logistics network was dismantled. A central coordinator was taken into custody. From a U.S. law enforcement perspective, this was a decisive strike, not just against a cartel, but against the system that allowed it to function inside American territory. The operation showed how the United States now confronts transnational crime, not through isolated arrests or border-only enforcement, but through intelligence sharing, coordinated federal action, and the targeting of infrastructure rather than individuals alone. Instead of chasing shipments one by one, agencies focused on breaking the chain that moved money, data, and drugs across state lines. At the same time, the case revealed an uncomfortable truth. These networks did not survive because they were hidden in remote areas or foreign territory. They survived because they learned how to operate inside legitimate systems, using logistics hubs, corporate structures, and political blind spots to stay protected. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that the threat was not only external, but internal. From a strategic standpoint, this is where the challenge grows more complex. Arresting cartel leaders and seizing drugs delivers immediate impact. Changing the conditions that allow such networks to take root is slower, harder, and less visible. Corruption, regulatory gaps, and the sheer scale of modern logistics create opportunities that criminal organizations are quick to exploit. The fentanyl crisis makes this struggle even more urgent. Synthetic drugs move faster, cost less to produce, and cause damage at a scale that overwhelms communities before enforcement can react. Every disrupted network matters, but each success also raises the same question. How many others are already adapting, watching, and preparing their next move? This operation demonstrated American capacity, coordination, and resolve. It also served as a reminder that modern cartels do not rely on chaos. They rely on efficiency. And efficiency is hardest to fight when it blends into everyday life. The war against fentanyl and transnational crime is far from over. It is evolving, becoming quieter, more technical, and more deeply embedded in systems once considered safe. What happens next will depend not only on enforcement, but on oversight, accountability, and public awareness. So the question remains, do you think operations like this are enough to stop modern cartel networks, or are they only slowing a system that continues to adapt? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to keep exploring the hidden mechanics behind global crime, military operations, and security strategies, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with military power.